Hey, how's it? So I started gardening in 2023, and in that first season I managed to grow about 6.5 kilograms of butternuts. This time, however, I've managed to already harvest 7.5 kilograms of butternut, with about 50 more still on the way. In this video I'm basically just going to show you guys what happened, what I've done, and how I've managed to get such a crazy harvest this year. So if you've been struggling with butternut, or you want to try and increase your harvest, well, then this video is for you. So let's just get into it. Hey, so as I was editing the video, I realized, okay, this is turning into a very long video. So I decided to split this video up into two parts. Essentially, this video, part one, is going to focus on the contextualization of everything. So what happened in the first season, what happened in the second season, what have I done, and basically just my general experience growing butternut. And then in part two, I'm going to discuss my findings, everything that I've learned along the way, and basically what will I be doing going forward. So this is essentially now a two-part video. So look out for the next one, and then hopefully you guys can get the full thing, because there's so much information. I don't want to really take anything out that's going to be pertinent to the subject at hand. So in that first season in 2023, when I grew butternuts, it was a little bit of an unplanned event. So as I indicated in the coriander video, I basically started gardening for a herb garden. But when I planted a whole bunch of scraps here in preparation for all the herbs, I actually had quite a few sprouts. At the time, I didn't really know what they were, but I left it. Eventually, I found out that it was gem squash and butternut. So with this bed here, this is where it all began. They all germinated from this origin. I cleaned up the bed, ended up transplanting a lot of those around here with a bit of marigolds and sweet alyssum. I basically let them grow a little bit taller, a little bit bigger, and in that time, I thought there was enough space. In that time, a lot more seeds ended up germinating. And I think really what ended up happening is the first, if I recall, the first seeds that germinated were actually the gem squash. So I had more of the gem squash on this side, and that sort of second flush was mostly butternut. So they all ended up taking up this whole area. But I had to do a bit of work before I could do that. This was just in that first season. This was basically the only garden bed that I had that I was busy cultivating. So I removed all the grass, put a thin layer of compost across the area, wet it, and then from that second flush of seeds, I ended up planting them up. What I did notice, however, is the leaves of the squash that I ended up planting here, they were actually quite large, so I thought that I didn't give them enough space. So this time I gave them plenty space, and just as well that I did, because butternuts, they grow pretty large. I didn't know how large they would grow. So I had butternuts scattered across all around here by the tree, growing quite nicely, and over the season they would get so long I ended up using this tree as a trellis. So just how I have all the butternuts here climbing into this tree, this is where I got the idea from. In 2023 they started crawling up, and I basically just trained them up. So I had like a bit of a butternut tree. Now what I do want to mention is I had about 10 butternut vines, and over the season there were a few times when I harvested butternuts. I knew roughly what size they would get to, the fruits, and I knew roughly what they would need it to look like, because we eat quite a lot of butternuts. I just didn't know when to harvest. So consulting with a family member, my aunt said they're ready. They've already turned color, they've already got a nice shade on them, they're ready to harvest. Not knowing really what's correct or not, I harvested. I was very disappointed with the flavor, to be honest. It was, even when cooked, it still tasted raw. There wasn't a lot of sugar development. It wasn't very sweet. It was actually very lackluster. So it was very disappointing. I ended up leaving them longer to ripen up. And I think there was one other occasion after that when I harvested again, just to test it, because I thought maybe, okay, it was just a horrible butternut. And again, it was a very lackluster result. And eventually over the growing season, so when I planted them up, it was probably, I didn't really record it but I remember it being somewhere around September, October, maybe as late as November when I eventually transplanted them out. So they grew over at least November, December, January. In mid-February, we had a massive hailstorm. And it did a lot of damage to the garden, the whole area as a general. But because of the amount of hail and how cold the water was, from the rain, all the squash plants died off. So there were no leaves remaining, the stems were actually damaged, and a few of the fruits, the gem squashes and the butternut, were damaged as well. So those I had to compost. So I was forced at this point to harvest. I harvested in total, including the ones beforehand, it came to about 6.5 kilograms. When I harvested the butternuts due to the hailstorm, there were some that were ripe, some that were not ripe. They were green. But I wasn't sure if they would taste right, so I tried most of them. The green ones we tried, they were no good. They were very raw, and it's kind of difficult to explain. It was almost like I was eating glue. It was very disgusting. So we ended up composting them all. But the ones that were a little bit more ripe, we tried those in hopes that, they've had a little bit more time than the previous ones to ripen up and they would be alright. So we tried them, and once again, with very lackluster results, not very sweet, not very nice. So we basically just tossed those as well straight into the compost, and we left it. Because at this point in time, autumn was approaching, so I couldn't really reset the beds, I couldn't restart them. So we left them, and that was pretty much our growing season. Okay, so then coming into this season, or the 2024 growing season, I knew I wanted to try butternuts again. I had to. We love butternuts. But I knew that I needed to give them more space, and I wanted to actually plant a lot more. So what I did is, again, a little bit unplanned, I knew that I wanted to plant all the butternuts in this sort of area behind me. So again, with scraps that I planted on the backside of that peach tree, I had a lot of volunteers. Most of it was gem squash, but a few of them ended up turned out to be butternut vines. Now, I left them because they had grown there previously. They had grown there very well. So I thought, you know what, let's leave sleeping dogs to lie, let them grow, let them produce fruit and do what they need to. But I knew I needed to do something in terms of support. So what I decided to do, everything that I would eventually plant on this side and even here behind me, I wanted to trellis it. So we have quite a few pallets, wood pallets in the yard that I wanted to turn into a different project, but I decided to turn those into trellises. I ended up planting a whole bunch of butternuts all across the yard. I planted a few here. I think it was one there, one there, one there. I think there were two there. There were two there next to that that sort of purplish tree there. I planted two there. I also had a few butternuts that I planted here, and you can actually see, so one of the vines are coming down there, one of the vines are coming down, and I think this one's died. In addition to that, I also ended up planting some up here where the tomatoes were originally. The whole idea was really just to sort of hedge my beds, plant them wherever. I knew they would get quite long. At this point, this is when I had my injury, early November. When that happened, or just before my injury, everything was growing nicely, everything was still alright. But because of the injury, I wasn't able to do anything. You can see how everything has taken over. Because they didn't have any support or any real management or direction to grow in, they did what they do. Now, I will say I was very surprised, I am still very surprised at how much they're growing. Last year, the vines grew to 2, maybe 3 meters on average each. This time, however, each of my wall panels is about 1.4 meters. So where I stand now, these are already like about 3 meters, and that's just in a single, or 6 meters in a single straight line direction. So if I assume that there is no rambling, then these vines are at least 6 meters long, and that's with me topping them off. If I had planted less, vines, then it wouldn't have been so crazy, but they would still get quite long. Now, this area here gets about 10 hours of sun per day. Same as there by the tomatoes. However, this patch behind me, this peach tree, it gets around about 7 hours of sun per day. What I have noticed is in the areas, let me show you guys. So for example, this area here behind the peach tree and this arborvitae, it gets about 5 hours of sun per day, but just as soon as you sort of reach here in the sort of middle area, this area gets about 7 hours of sun per day. Everything behind the arborvitae did not set any fruit. Even in the first season, everything that was sort of central in that little corner there didn't produce any fruit. They set flowers but no fruit. Everything on this front side, I mean, you can see the fruit here, they've set fruit and obviously flowers. However, they're not setting as much new growth as it. I have also been doing a little bit of landscaping, I'm not gonna lie, but they are producing new leafy growth, but not nearly as vigorously as some of these other places. And you can see even some of these fruit are quite undeveloped. Actually, this one might still develop. But now, this area here, where we get 10 hours of sun per day, not only has each vine produced multiple fruit, but they're still setting flowers, they're still setting fruit, and they're still putting on leafy growth. I'm basically topping these guys off like at least once a week. I mean, you can see how crazy this is. I've got butternuts all over this area. There. Yeah, so it's a little bit crazy. You definitely want to make sure that you're giving full sun to butternuts. They'll get out of hand. One thing that we did start having issues with, in December, it wasn't evident at the time, but Joburg had a bit of an issue with fruit flies and flies in general over December and February, just because of all the rain and the moisture. In January, early mid-January, somewhere around there, I started noticing these very strange injuries on some of the butternuts, and it all started from here. This is where I first found them. I found butternuts here, they've been punctured, and it almost looked like they were fizzing out. And I didn't know what that was. It was strange. So I opened one of them up, and I found maggots, which was pretty damn disgusting. I didn't know what was going on. And it's not like the awesome maggot that listens to Slipknot. No, these are bad maggots. They were busy chowing my fruit, so I was quite upset. But it was only here, so I inspected everything around here, no additional damage. And then I watched a few videos, try to understand what's going on. And that's when I realized I've got a fruit fly issue. So what happens is the fruit flies, they'll target the young soft fruits, but I have had damages on more mature butternuts that has been a little bit hardened, but not all the way. They'll puncture the flesh of the fruit, they'll lay the eggs in it, and obviously the maggots will consume the fruit, they'll pupate, they'll grow, and then they'll turn into new fruit flies. Now, apparently, a female fruit fly can lay about 500 eggs per party, which is insane, bro. I wish I had 500 butternuts just to hedge my bets a little bit further. Fortunately, however, I've had only about 10 butternuts that I've had to throw away because of it, but it's still frustrating. Now, even knowing that I have a fruit fly issue, and I haven't seen the fruit flies, I've only seen them once. So I can't even spray them or like whack them and wake them up and tell them to shoot. So that's not an option. But now, because of all the foliage, all the growth, even that area there, because they're all essentially creating this like sort of like lattice of vines and butternuts, it's very difficult to walk in there. So I can't, and because of the amount of butternuts and obviously being unprepared, I don't have anything to protect them, like a physical barrier just to prevent the fruit flies from punching them. Now, I've taken to Reddit, and apparently you can use like socks, stockings, and something called an organza bag. I don't know, I suspect it's a brand name, I don't know, but And in terms of cost and availability, I don't know, you'll have to check that out locally, but apparently they work quite well. I am concerned, however, with the thickness of stockings. I'm not sure if those will be very effective. So if you, again, just like with the corn, if you have an abundance of socks or any other material, then wrap the butternuts to try and prevent it. Now, what you would need to do, however, is ensure that it's not too tight on the fruit. Otherwise, you're going to restrict growth of the fruit. Because when the butternuts are still young, they're very pliable. So what will end up happening is they'll almost take up parts of the shapes wherever they're resting at. So I have a few deformed butternuts just because they're resting in corners and stuff. So you do want to make sure that whatever you do use for fruit fly management, that it's not too tight. Okay, so something I didn't actually mention just now, when I planted everything up, or when I sowed all the seeds, I used a little bit of compost, but I didn't have much compost at hand. So I basically just amended the holes or the areas very locally with a little bit of compost. I would estimate it was about a shovel full of compost per planting hole. I also did multi-seed, about 2 seeds per hole, because generally I have very good germination on my butternuts. And apart from the compost, I had scraps that I have been burying since I basically started across, mostly across that area. This is a new bed that I started burying scraps in sort of about winter last year. And everything behind me there, that's all brand new, that's start of spring. Also planted scraps, however. But because of the injury, I wasn't able to do anything, so there was no further fertilization after the beginning of November of last year. So November, December, January, February, so that's already 4 months where I've applied no additional fertilizer, no additional feed or anything. I mean, these dudes are doing pretty well. They're still putting on growth and a lot of stuff. With regards to mulch, so I quite enjoy using grass clippings. We also do have a relatively large lawn. The grass clippings it's free, it's readily available for us. They break down relatively quickly, but not too quickly that it's a bit of a problem. I do find, however, it's very, very light, so it tends to blow in the wind. But otherwise, it's a fantastic mulch. In winter of last year, I also had, in this original bed here, I did have a lot of leaves and stuff. In some of the other beds here that I did create later on, I did have some leaves and other stuff on hand that I was able to just chuck on as mulch. But otherwise, most of the mulch nutrition is just from the grass clippings because it breaks down so easily. One other thing that you do need to consider is watering. When the butternuts are young, even though they have very large leaves, or shall I say, because they have large leaves, they tend to be quite thirsty. Now, I haven't really looked at the roots in as much detail as some of the other plants, but they tend to put out very small root balls. They seem to be quite shallow. They don't seem to go very deep. And because of that, if you're in a very hot climate, they take a lot of heat stress. Now, these plants, now that they're established and have multiple rooting areas, man, they can go like a whole week or 2 without me having to water them, and they'll be fine. They look a little bit sad, but they'll be fine. However, when they're young, they take a lot of heat stress per day, and then they look quite terrible. So you need to make sure that wherever you plant them, you have a mulch laid down to prevent excess moisture loss. And you want to make sure that at the heat of the day, you check the soil, just make sure that it's still nice and moist. And if you see that the leaves are a bit droopy, give them a bit of water. Just make sure that you're not overwatering them, but you do want to make sure that they're still staying nice and cool. Once they're established, they're very, very drought tolerant. They're very resistant to a lot of heat stress, especially when they sort of do this like massive squash patch mulching effect where they're super close together. But otherwise, you do want to look at making sure that they are sufficiently watered. So overall, my experience growing butternut's been pretty positive. I've had quite a few very interesting experiences, and this season has been very different to last season, which is really interesting, especially with regards to the pests, the injury, and just the general craziness of everything. But they're really easy. Just make sure that you give them all the space that they need, full sun, ensure that they're nicely watered, especially when they're young. And if you do have a very humid climate and you know that fruit flies could be a potential issue, try and ensure that there's enough space to be able to protect all the fruits, either with an organza bag, a sock, stockings or whatever. If you're able to give them some form of a trellis so that it's easy for you to gain access to all the fruits, even better. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is part 1 of 2. This video just outlining the whole general experience. In the next video, I'll be going over in detail with all the findings and the recommendations going forward in order to get better harvests and easier harvests, and just to better manage everything that's going on. So look out for part 2 of this Butternut videos. Yeah. So if you enjoy hearing me ramble on about gardening stuff, check out some of the other videos in the playlist.